All right, welcome Sherry and Jamie. I think since we are at our time, we're going to start the meeting, but before we do roll call, I have a statement that I need to read.
You can actually read the statement first, and then we
Yes.
can do roll call from there.
Right, so we'll do the statement first. Pursuant to recently adopted amendments to the Illinois Opens Meeting Act, included in Public Act 101-0640, public bodies may, in certain circumstances, hold entirely virtual public meetings without a quorum physically present in any one location. On March 18, 2020, Village President Kathleen O'Hara issued a declaration of emergency pursuant to the authority granted by the Village Code, the Illinois Municipal Code, and the Illinois Emergency Management Agency Act to address the health threat posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. On May 29, 2020, Governor Pritzker issued a disaster proclamation that declared in-person attendance at public meetings of more than 10 people at the regular public meeting location to be infeasible in accordance with the Open Meetings Act as amended by Public Act 101-0640. On June 16, 2020, Village President O'Hara executed a written determination that, given the ongoing emergency with the COVID-19 pandemic, in-person meetings of the Village Board are not practical or prudent at this time and until further notice. In accordance with the Governor's disaster proclamation and the Village President's declaration of emergency and determination regarding meetings of the Village Board, I, as Chair of the Historic Preservation Commission, hereby determine that in-person meetings of the Historic Preservation Commission are not practical or prudent at this time and until further notice. And with that statement in the record, and I understand I just have to do it once, no matter how many meetings we have that are. Let's
until further notice.
Order, and could you do the roll call, please?
Certainly. Member Bergman.
Here.
Member George.
Here.
Member Leibold is absent. Member Nickel.
Here.
Member Richardson.
Here.
And Chair Krause.
Here, and we have a quorum.
We have a quorum.
Agenda item number 2 is consideration of the March 11, 2020 regular meeting minutes. They were previously distributed to us in this very low-key color paper. I would entertain a motion to approve.
I have one correction.
Sure, go ahead.
At the bottom of page 2, second to the last paragraph, the second line under the Glenn Summers presentation.
Okay.
Second to the last word, I think it's supposed to be assets. I don't think we wanted assets in there.
Probably not. I'm still trying to find it. So page 2.
It's page 2.
Second line of the second to the last paragraph under Glenn Summers' presentation.
There's a missing T.
There's a missing
Oh.
T.
Yeah.
I read carefully. It
Yes.
made me laugh, but I think we have to fix it.
Colorful words on a colorful paper.
Right?
Yeah. Any
Social
other
history of the village too.
change? Entertain a motion to approve with that one correction.
I'll make the motion.
Second.
Second.
Motion and approval. Any discussion? And one of the rules of doing this remotely is that every vote needs to be a roll call vote. So roll call vote on the approval of the minutes as corrected.
Member Bergman.
Yes.
George.
Yes.
Member Nickel.
Yes.
Member Richardson.
Yes.
Chair Krause.
Yes.
Motion carries.
So the third item is non-agenda items and visitors. So Glenn, help us. If there were visitors, or if there are, how would they appear on the screen, or what's the protocol for that?
Sure. So I would note that we don't have any, so this is a hypothetical discussion, at least tonight, but in the future, there are a few ways people can participate. They can call in via phone using the information on the agenda, in which case, of course, they won't appear before you, but they'd be able to speak. If they joined us via Zoom, we can give them the opportunity to speak or even to present video or anything they would bring with them. We do publish that we accept emails in advance, and to the extent I received those, I didn't see any the last time I checked. We would read those aloud as public comments if they're of a certain length, or we would distribute them to you. And then finally, the fourth one is now that we are in this new way of doing virtual meetings, only as of a few weeks ago, where we have the legislature making this hybrid path. In theory, a few people could join us here at Village Hall. If they did, we would point a camera at them and give them a chance to speak.
Okay. But we have no one under any of those modes tonight, so we'll move to agenda item number 4, which is the biggest discussion, which is the discussion of the proposed revisions to the Historic Preservation Ordinance. We've talked about this, gosh, it seems like over a year. And over the course of the last couple of months, the attorneys and Glenn have put together a document that Glenn and I have gone over 2 or 3 times, and we thought it was the right timing to have this presentation to the HPC of the revised ordinance. So rather than open it up for questions right now, what I thought we'd do is go through the PowerPoint presentation and do it interactively. So if anyone has questions on a point, then Glenn's going to present. If anyone has questions on a point, we should just talk about it as we're going through the presentation. And then when we're finished, we can wrap up with overall questions, and I can give you a sense of what the next steps are. Sound okay?
Yes.
Okay. Glenn, do you want to?
Certainly. Let's do it. And let me note in advance, I'm having a bit of respiratory trouble, so bear with me if I struggle a little bit here. But I think we're going to do A-okay.
All right.
Again, as Chair Kraus mentioned, this is the culmination of a lot of work by this committee in trying to, sorry, I'm not sure why that's advancing on its own, even the best of us, by this committee in trying to implement, we're just going to do it by hand. That is interesting. So a lot of work by this committee in trying to think of the best policy directions to make historic preservation work in the village. When I first came to the village was during, as some of you might recall, 512 Sunrise, and at that time, you know, there was expressed some strong concerns that even though the village had looked at this ordinance in the past, that it still hadn't struck the right balance between the rights of individual property owners and wanting to make preservation attractive to them, and then also sort of the broader needs of having the regulatory tools in place to do preservation. So what we've tried to do is to, I'll skip ahead and then come back, but our goals as we go through this are, 1, to implement your plan, choosing Lake Bluff, specifically 2 planks that come through here, we can chat about the others, is the extended review periods and the implementation of historic districts. And then also, you know, this ordinance is 20 years or so old. We have a lot of experience with it at this point. We really tried to rewrite it in a way that's very clear, very functional, that we hope is a good model going forward, especially considering how technical some of these concepts are. So with that, a refresher, right? Even on this commission, I'm sure that it's hard to keep track of all the little bells and whistles we have in place today. So briefly, these are the tools we have in the toolbox right now. We have significant demolition review, and that's any property in the village that's over 50 years old proposed for destruction. We can designate landmarks. Once a landmark is designated, changes to it have to be reviewed by this commission, at least to the exterior appearance of the changes. And that's subject to a maximum delay period. In other towns, you can say no. In Lake Bluff and in some other North Shore communities, it's only a maximum period of delay. And then finally, there's an optional route we'll discuss a little later. So again, significant demolition review. Any structure 50 years or older, regardless of any perceived significance, value, what have you. We determine what a demolition is based on a calculation that looks at floor area. If it's over 50% of floor area, we bring it to this commission, which is a little interesting in that, again, we'll come back to this. The ordinance usually has an interest in exterior architectural appearance, right? And we've tried to refocus in on that with some of these changes. But when we look at floor area, we're really talking about interior walls and things that you don't see from the street. And that's one of the changes we'll come back to. And then finally, something that comes to you through this path, you can delay for a maximum of 120 days. In the ordinance, it reads that the purpose of that delay is to allow time for someone to prepare a landmark nomination. Landmarks, you designate structures, buildings, sites, or landscapes as landmarks. There are 20 different criteria that define significance: general significance, social significance, architectural significance. And there are 4 parties that can apply to designate a property. The HPC can, the village board can, the owner can, or then the Belay Center, now the History Museum, could choose to do so. Once it's landmarked, changes have to be reviewed. Alterations go up to a maximum of 65 days, demolitions up to 150 in total after extended. There's this interesting 2-step process where you meet to decide if you're going to review it, and then you do subsequent review meetings. I want to note that we've eliminated, or at least smoothed that out a little bit in the redraft. And then there is a rule that requires at this stage that the applicant participate at least once. Finally, there is a certification pathway. The idea is that a property owner could voluntarily say that they want to be bound, and they want any future property owner to be bound by this village's review. So it turns from a delay into a permission is required type of situation. Again, it's totally voluntary, and no one in the village has done it as of yet. If it helps you to visualize, this is a slide from choosing Lake Bluff for your plan. Again, this is summarizing what I just talked about. If you're not designated, 120 days. If you are a designated structure, up to potentially 150 days. So what did we do? We did a whole lot. We did 33 pages, a whole lot. Again, there's only so not dry I can make these things, so I beg your forgiveness. But again, we tried to implement your policy goals and also make a really robust ordinance that's also, we hope, easier to understand, easier to follow, easier for everybody to wrap themselves around. So we'll talk through these tools again. First, some high-level concepts. We focus in very precisely on exterior architectural appearance. We don't want there to be any thought that we're looking at interiors. To some extent, if this looks at architectural appearance from the street, so think about that in the sense of, if you're building a shed or if you're doing things at the back of the house, additions, how much are you concerned about those? Given our context and in Lake Bluff and that first point, architectural appearance, we really focus in our landmark ordinance on discrete features, on things. So right now, for example, you can landmark a site, but it's not entirely clear what that means. If you look at the National Register criteria, they were included in your packet. A site it's a very abstract thing. I mean, unless you have a very momentous event, it's really hard to recognize, and it's even harder when you think about the interaction between its significance and how we regulate it and what the village changes, how it treats a landmark versus something else. And then finally, there's just a lot of sanding down of rough edges with approvals. So from time to time, there's been this idea that owners would come and seek an approval for demolition and then flip the house. We make it clear you can't do that. We make a pathway to administratively approve minor changes. We talk about a bit. At least at this stage, this is one of our discussion points. The owner has to participate throughout a review process. Again, that plus these longer reviews, that may be an unintended consequence, but we've put in some stronger language to make sure specifically the owner, you can compel the owner or at least someone with power of attorney to appear and participate in these reviews. And then finally, this is maybe an innovative one. We'll see how it goes over. But if you think about it, in towns with a traditional historic preservation ordinance that have certificates of appropriateness, the fancy term for you must have permission, they have carte blanche pretty much to impose conditions consistent with, of course, legal precedent and their ordinances and their strictures, but they can require people to do things to obtain an approval. One of the things, so thinking about this as what changed when you went to a delay-focused ordinance. One, people don't have to show up anymore. They can just run out the clock, fix that. And then two, you lose a lot of ability to impose conditions. I mean, it's a negotiation. And that's still in some sense true, but what we've done here is make a mechanism where if an owner agrees to do something, you can bind them to that, and you have more flexibility in how you use your review authority and your delay authority to try and make some outcomes that really work to further historic preservation. We'll talk about a couple examples. Again, this is just...
Glenn, can you go back a bit? I have a couple of just clarifying questions on this, and if others have questions on this as well. So the non-transferable approvals, so first of all, does this apply to demolitions as well as advisory reviews to changes to a landmark, or just to demolitions?
Yeah, so page 12.
That's where I'm at.
So yeah, any advisory review, demolition review, anything like that.
Okay, so it's anything that would come before us. And the concept here is that the owner of record at the point of an approval, so if it's a demolition or if it's a advisory review on a landmark, that approval is only applicable to that owner and cannot be transferred.
Unless you would provide otherwise, yeah.
But under the normal protocols, so if someone comes to us and wants to demolish that structure, and either the time has expired or we say it's okay, that demolition authorization from the HPC only applies to that property owner and not to someone who subsequently would buy that property.
Unless you would allow it, yes.
Okay, that's good. The minor changes on the administration,
Let me interrupt you for just a second.
Go ahead.
We had the McCormick Blair property up at Crabtree Farm, and the family wanted to tear the house down in an effort to make the house more saleable. And so that would apply to if they had a buyer waiting in the wings, they couldn't then transfer the right to tear down the house to the buyer. Is that what I?
So let me go. My understanding is they could not transfer the right to tear down the house to a buyer, but they could tear down the house and then sell.
Okay, all right.
That's correct.
So they had to incur the cost, okay, of tearing the house down. Great, thank you.
Okay. And then owner must participate. I know that's of concern to some of the members. So you are trying to define two things, both owner, which for this purpose is being defined as the actual owner or as an individual with power of attorney, and then participate. So help me again with what does participate mean, both in a demolition request and in a advisory review of a landmark.
Sure, and the language is essentially the same. So if you have a copy of the ordinance, if you go to page 17, I'm using the line numbers at the left. This is line 33. So when we say participate, it just means this. If you have a meeting and there's not a qualified representative there, that means the owner or someone with power of attorney, you make a motion, you second it, and you stop the clock until first of these three things. So 30 days goes by, the clock starts again if for some reason you would not meet. The next time you meet, the clock starts again. Or finally, if you were to call a special meeting, the clock starts again. So again, inside that mechanism tries to keep anything weird from going on as far as not trying to make a pathway to extend that review where someone is participating, participating as in being physically present.
Okay.
Yeah.
So participate is being physically present, that's fine. And what this really then is saying is that a qualified representative must be at every scheduled meeting where this item is on the agenda.
As it's written right now, yes.
Okay.
That's one of our discussion points. We should look at that closely.
Yeah, just wanted to make sure. Okay.
Let me clarify that. I thought that when you first brought this up as a change that they had to be at least one meeting.
So as it's written right now for advisory reviews, it's at least one. As this is drafted, this revised ordinance, we left this for now. It is every meeting. So at any particular time, if an owner were to fail, or excuse me, a representative would fail to appear, and if you were to decide to impose it, you could extend the clock beyond any other extension available to you.
Okay.
And so,
Yeah.
so it's a representative or someone with power of attorney, because they would not necessarily be the same thing.
Yeah, so it's a defined term here. The qualified representative is either the owner or someone with power of attorney. So if I say, I don't want to deal with the Lake Bluff Historic Preservation Commission, I have a dinner date at Innovasi tonight, I can go pay my lawyer $600 to go and talk to you for me, and that is acceptable.
So a lawyer has power of attorney?
Well, it's anybody who has the power of attorney, including, you simply give it to your realtor, and suddenly we have the realtor showing up, like we have in so many of our regular situations.
Right.
Yeah.
But
This is not,
they have to put the documentation together and theoretically show it to the village that they went through the process of putting together the power of attorney document and signing it. And I think they have to notarize it and then present it to the village.
So in that case, someone who's an owner would actually not ever have to show up.
correct.
Yeah. And there are, I should be clear that power of attorney doesn't just mean attorneys. We could look at other ways to limit this. It's just at a certain point, someone who has And I would mention too, we can have the village attorney speak to this at another meeting if you like, but at some point, someone who has power of attorney gets to act as that person, whether we like it or not.
So hypothetically, someone could give someone else power of attorney for that day.
Yes.
As a non-lawyer, that's my understanding, yes.
Yes. Right.
But
Okay.
and then ongoing, or did they have to redo it each meeting? I would think ongoing.
Yeah, typically what happens is that if there is a power of attorney granted by an owner to another individual, then it would specify that it is limited to the particular issue in front of our board, and that it would apply to all instances of that representative appearing before the board. So they wouldn't have to do it for each meeting, but there would have to be some process that was put in place.
Okay, so in the case where
And
we're
really,
discussing 512 Sunrise
Mhm.
and the landscaper showed up, did he have power of attorney? At the time, I realized this was not in place then, but
the power of attorney is only limited by the skill of the draftsman drafting the document. So yes, it could be the landscaper showing up for only one meeting. It could be the real estate agent showing up for all matters pertaining to village affairs. It could be related to the
Yeah.
lawyer with regards to all matters regarding the entire transaction. So it could be limited by time, it could be limited by scope, and they can be quite broad if need be. So the power granted by the grantor can be very broad.
so there's still a lot of wiggle room in this, isn't
Right.
there?
Yes.
My point is, we can do one of these and never see anybody but the realtor.
Yeah, and
Okay.
there's probably not a real good way to get around that, is there?
And your comment is, you know, we can do this whole thing by only having the landscaper show up. You know?
Yes.
I tell you what, guys, if you'd like to move on and double back to this, I think the village attorney could join us at least for a bit in maybe 5 or 10 minutes. We can come back to this subject and he might be able to give you a better treatment of it than I can.
Sure.
That would be great.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
One last point. It's my understanding from the last times we had village attorneys present that it's virtually impossible to force the actual owner to show up live in flesh and in blood. So it's almost impossible to have that happen. So we may get kind of stuck on this point. We may end up having to force Glenn into being the reader of all sorts of documents of powers of attorney.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well, is that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to force the owner under Illinois law. Again, that being an attorney, we can ask the attorney if there are options. For example, we could suggest that the owner be present at least once, but that other individuals who have been granted power of attorney could appear at other times. This seemed to be a reasonable. The owner has to do something to acknowledge the fact that this is under review and go through a process of identifying an individual formally to address our concerns. But let's hold on to that. That's a good point, Glenn. And if we need to, we'll roll back and see if the attorney can either come on the phone tonight or another time.
You're still forcing the owner to spend the money to prepare a 3 or 4 page power of attorney document and present it to Glenn. So, you know, it's,
Yeah.
you know, you can save the $500 by showing up, or you could, you know, spend the 500 and send Glenn, you know, the little love letter. So
I'd prefer there was an option where I get the 500, but I think that's illegal.
yeah.
We
So,
can do
Glenn-
that if you can make it be the owner every time.
Yeah, I don't think we can do that. I'm pretty sure we can. So Glenn, At what point do you want to talk about sites? You want to talk about that now or at some other time? Landscape specifically.
Yeah, we can talk about that now. So this is jumping ahead to another
It's the next
discussion.
one.
Yeah, another discussion point for the group. So again, if we frame this as this ordinance has always been written about, and for the village as a regulator, it always makes sense to be about exterior architectural appearance, right? And that's usually pretty simple. We landmark buildings. I have a building. I know what it looks like. There's not a whole lot of abstraction to it. For the Federal National Register, which is where a lot of this derives from, they're really looking at more than building permits, right? They're looking at what resources should be recognized and should be protected and should be considered when federal dollars go into a project. Just the same as, you know, the federal environmental reviews look at the quality of the environment before you put in a highway, for example. Whether or not that has ever been looked at or analyzed or considered before, right? So understand that these have two different purposes. Our local regulations that really deal with building and what the National Register works with, but they still feed off each other. What we have today is you can have a building, a site, a structure, or a landscape. Those are the four types, and they're actually not that well defined in our ordinance. You can get to what they were meant to speak to. In National Register parlance, right, a building is a structure for habitation. A house, a structure is a structure not for habitation, right? A construction that you don't live in. The gazebo on the village green, a great example. A site is not a construction, it's where something happened. So the examples here, right? You have funerary sites, rock shelters, gardens, battlefields, shipwrecks, cemeteries, springs. Hard to see how that works with our building permits, right? And then finally, in National Register parlance, a landscape is a subset of a site. It's one particular type of site. And there's a separate publication talking about how you would recognize them. But what's really important to understand is there's a real divergence, if you would, between the tools we have, or at least that we've had, and how you would impose those, regulate to protect a landscape. We spent a lot of time going around how do you really operationalize that, my $2 word for the day, and we wanted to bring it to you before we kept going. So specifically the problem is this, I mean, not everything, most things in a landscape you can destroy really without a building permit. So if you have something like a bridge, you would need a building permit for that. But things like bushes, trees, perhaps natural grades, fields, flowers, statuaries, you know, benches, on and on. I don't say this to try to be exhaustive, but you know, most of those things can come and go without building permits, by neglect. Some of those the village issues tree permits for, but the historic preservation ordinance has never been applied to those. And that's a whole other world of regulation we can talk about. But landscapes in particular were problematic for us in the drafting process. And there's really, for existing landmarks, there's Stonebridge as far as an independently notable landscape. We can think of one more example in town, perhaps. I mean, maybe two if you're looking at Crabtree Farm. You can look at Crabtree and you can look at Lakeland Avenue. But those are, that's that world. So the principle we think makes sense, focus it on physical, tangible things that take building permits if you wanted to go that route, but understand that we leave some of those other items on the table. And in this particular case, we theoretically remove protection from one notable recognized thing in the village, being the front 10 acres of Stonebridge. Mind you that that is subject to other approvals to keep those 10 acres in their current state.
Okay, so let's put this into a series of discussion pieces. If everybody can turn to page 5 of the ordinance, underline 6, that's where the definition of a building is. I think everyone would agree that a building is appropriate to be protected. And building are expanded to include houses, barns, stables, sheds, garages, courthouses, offices, train depots, churches, schools, stores, and theaters. So if we're worried about barns or stables or greenhouses or sheds, those are buildings under this definition. So that's one, and I think we can all agree that this is something that we're looking to be able to protect. The second is structure, and that's on page 7, line 38. So examples, bridges, fire towers, silos, roadways, railroads, gazebos. And I think we would also agree that those are things that a structure, if we so would like, would be something that would be landmarkable under this definition. So the one we're left with is landscape, and that's on page 6, beginning with line 20. And I think the question before us is, are we comfortable not having the authority to landmark a landscape simply because, as we've learned, it is very difficult to define and very difficult to determine if there have been substantive changes to it. But landscape has planned landscapes, dividers, site furnishing, so benches, planters, urns, bodies of water, parks, gardens, arboreta, plazas, greens, recreational grounds. So I would appreciate some comments from the commissioners on landscape before we move on.
I have more than a few.
Go ahead.
Okay. So if we want to talk about built landscapes, we have a Jens Jensen entrance to Harrison House. And it consists of a road. It's a curvilinear road that goes past gate posts. It curves around. At Harrison House, it goes actually over the water. And then it curves around. It distinctly under Jens Jensen's theory, which goes back to, I'm gonna get out my history books here. It goes back to a man named Capability Brown in the 1700s in England, who specifically took you on a journey as you went in the front driveway. And as you drive towards the house, suddenly you make a wild ass turn, and suddenly you're driving away from the house and into woods where you can't see the house, which occurs when you drive into Harrison House. Suddenly you're driving west, and then suddenly you take a sharp turn to the south and you're pointing away from the house. You can't see the house because of the woods. And then you come around on a big, broad, sweeping arc to where you can see the house. That's a typical Jens Jensen landscape design. This is landscape design that's about 300 years old. When Capability Brown designed this in the 1700s, it was all out of manicured landscapes. Now what Jensen wants to do is do it out of all prairie-style landscapes in the Midwest. Jensen does exactly the same thing at Lansdowne. You drive into a driveway, the first thing you do pulling into the old driveway at Lansdowne was that you took an immediate left into the woods and you drove over a small bridge. Then you got a little poopsie-poo peak of the house across the green and you went back into the woods. and you went over another bridge, and you got another peekaboo look at the house. You went around a big curving arc to come to the main house.
Yeah. So Glenn, how does the,
Wait a
how
second,
do other
second.
communities?
Wait a second, not that. Despite all the barking dogs in the background,
Yeah, that's mine.
okay? Despite the barking dogs in the background, exactly the same thing happens at Tangley Oaks.
Yeah, and Paul, I can mention through.
Posts, you drive down a long winding driveway, you drive over a bridge, and then you drive off into the woods before you come around a huge winding arc. Okay, at Tangley Oaks, they had enough land to do it that it's a half-mile long arc. That's a huge developed landscape. It's a landscape that once you're sensitive to it, you recognize it as it's happening to you. And it's designed to essentially massage you into realizing that once you pull up to the front door, by God, you have arrived at the manor house. So that's the kind of landscape that you want to make sure that you're preserving.
Okay, so Glenn, how do other communities address those kinds of issues? Because
Sure. So I'd give you a bit of a litany. So first, Paul, and by explaining some of these, Paul, I hope you'll forgive me for speaking a bit imprecisely and saying that there's one we've recognized. Yeah. So looking at how other communities do this, I mean, I would say the first, which we use in Lake Bluff, right, is that those features, conservation easements, other easements of that type are incorporated into subdivision approvals. And so when subdivisions are approved, for example, for Tangley Oaks, they keep and preserve indefinitely, right, those curvilinear roads and some of those other features. Let's say we're looking at Harrison House. If that front 10 acres isn't landscaped, I mean, those development approvals as they exist today require them to keep some of those improvements. The conservation easement requires them to keep many other things. Those are robust tools built for the purpose. As we did our review of a lot of different ordinances, I would tell you, to be quite honest, I was looking for someone to steal some landscape language from. What there is here is there were organic drafts that I worked through with the village attorney, who I know has joined us at this point. And we weren't able to find a whole lot as far as things that look really at this. There was some language we looked at adapting that's really more oriented towards commercial site plan review. So that talks about the need to keep trees that are, the same size and coverage and maturity, and to protect specific species. And you could get there. I mean, we could work through it, but we didn't see that in other preservation ordinances. And that is a very, very distinct from the other things you have to work with. The last one I will note, which I think is unique to Chicagoland, I think Highland Park has it, is there is this idea of heritage trees or historic trees. So you designate a particular tree, essentially as inviolate. You'll say that we won't issue a tree permit to remove that tree unless certain circumstances were to happen. Again, I think the village attorney represents Highland Park and can speak personally to maybe a little better as to how that works.
Glenn, don't we already have a tree ordinance as well?
We do have a tree ordinance, yes. It's important to understand that you can, those trees are still private property and you can remove them. The tree ordinance just, among other things, imposes either the requirement that you replant or that you pay a fee. Obviously, there's a fee for the permit itself, but there's a grading system. Higher value trees cost more per caliper inch. And so removing trees can be a very expensive proposition, but you can still choose to do it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So my second thought is, having gathered Indian arrowheads in some of the ravines as a child, the site definition talks about prehistoric or historic sites relating to, sort of the archaeological cultures that may have been here before. And I'm wondering about development of properties, especially development along the ravines, or development along Green Bay Road, where the original, the very original, I'm trying to think. It's not Lake Bluff at that point. I think it's called Mallman, or no, it's called Rockland at that point. But when the Rockland neighborhood is there, I'm concerned about whether or not we are going to sacrifice some tools that may show indigenous cultures there, or other early settler cultures that are there. Now, if you've been following, I remember Lake Forest on Facebook very well. There's a huge conversation going on about the kids who grew up out on the Lasker estate in West Lake Forest, that while they were out there on Lasker's golf course, they're also out there finding lots and lots of piles of Indian arrowheads out there, showing that there's a lot of Indian activity in that park. So I don't think it's out of the ordinary. Archaeological digs show up in one of our historic sites. So I want to make sure that we have a sense that we're covering that also.
So Glenn, part of the difficulty with landmarking landscapes would be being able to define all of the specific parts, or define what makes it unique and needs to be landmarked, but then the enforcement part, which is more concerning or is leading to this decision, that it's difficult to enforce once you landmark a landscape, or just being able to specifically define what it is that you're landmarking.
All of the above. I mean, I would say the simplest way to look at it is we have a whole regulatory scheme, a big one, of regulating construction in the village, that this mostly, your historic preservation ordinance mostly functions as a part of. You have to build things, you need permits. Some of those things have historical implications. Before we issue a permit, we bring them to you. You know exactly what they are. There's great history about what they look like, and so on. And so it's all very linear. Between one building and the next, of course, there are specific historic considerations, but the process and what you're considering is very similar, right?
Right.
In so many ways, landscapes and prehistoric sites are very, very different. Many of the things that would disturb them not require permits from the village. If we think about things like arrowheads, I can just go out and I can pick up an arrowhead. And that's not to say that just because it's hard to enforce means it's futile. It's very, very substantially different from what this ordinance and others we reviewed are designed to do. And so that would be, part of that is there's an investment of time and effort involved, and if we put these things in place, how well used will they be? I mean, Stonebridge, again, is the only example we have, at least currently, of this tool being used in that context.
Mm-hmm.
And once you work through things, there's the question of just the practicalities of, if I tear out a bush, do I have to come to the HPC? If I tear out 10 bushes, if I tear out 50 bushes, but I replant the same bush.
Yeah.
I'm trying to be difficult. It's just,
Yeah,
it's a
I
hard.
understand. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and that's, my question is, you know, when you're thinking about the number of homes in our village, just regular homes, and the landscaping, I had to tear mine out because my basement was flooding and replaced it, and, you know, better, but, you know, I don't think we really want to regulate probably 99% of the landscape in every ordinary household in Bluff. So how do we write this so that that's not what we're looking at, and it doesn't put undue pressure on you or the homeowner, or you know, we're looking at the bigger, you know, things. Ravines, of course, they're important. We don't want people messing with that, but are there already some things in place to keep that from happening? So I'm just looking for, like, is there a delineation here between one and the other? Does that make sense?
So Glenn, with this, you're looking at landscapes as being distinct, a distinct landmark, not as part of a home. Is that correct?
That is a astute observation. So with some landmarks we have in the village, we have used the term I would say we use the term landscape or site imprecisely, and so at times the intent perhaps has not been so clear, at least in my brief reviews. I would think, again, looking at what this group has been concerned with, what this appears to have been written to do, and what its peers do in other communities, that you're really just, most of the time, you're just trying to look at the building.
Right.
In a historic district, perhaps you have other considerations as you move towards the street, right? You have lighting and walls and things like that that go into the character of the district that's well defined. But certainly in Lake Bluff, it looks like you mostly look at what's the house look like.
Right.
It seems to me that with the landscaping, when you think of things like the ravines, the bluffs, the beach, the front 10 acres of Stonegate, and say the Sheridan Road green path along there, those are already under protections. And as far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong. And honestly, I can't think, I've been sitting here trying to think of other places that belong to part of the park district, part of Lake Bluff open lands and so forth. Those things already are under protection. So I don't know if it really behooves us to spend a lot of time on this.
Well, there's a number of areas that are certainly under park district protection. The landscapes that you talk about along Sheridan Road, the landscape, the bottoms of the, some of the bottoms of the ravines in Lake Bluff are owned by the park district. Some of the bottoms of the lands, some of the bottoms of the ravines in Lake Bluff are owned individually. That is, your property line goes all the way out to the center of the creek. And so we're going to landmark a house that is on, let's say, Witchwood Drive or on Crescent Drive. Those properties actually extend, their land actually extends out to the center of the creek line. So if we discover that there's an Indian mound there of some sort, a collection of Indian arrowheads, does that become an archaeological site? That's something we have to wrestle with as it comes up. Okay, so with regards to some of the great big estates that are left in town, some of the approaches to those estates are landscaped environments. There are tree alleys, and there are the curving boulevards that lead up to these estate houses. Certainly, if you think of some of the houses, some of the big houses left on Sheridan Road, I'm thinking of the the house with the two gatehouses in front of it. That's an entire neighborhood in there of houses that's been developed, but that is developed under a very specific landscape design. And so at some point, does landscaping that, there's a beautiful center courtyard in there, about half of which is still extant. If that comes before us for review and for landmarking, then that's something I think we want to be able to have the tool there available for us to landmark it, to say, we can define this by acreage, we can define it by, by limits of, from here to there, and we can define it in terms of objects, whether we're talking about a roadway, a curvilinear roadway, whether it has a bridge in it, whether it has, beautiful garden pots out in the alleys and whatnot. Glenn, you say that Stonebridge is the only property that we've landmarked landscaping with, but haven't we landmarked some of the landscaping at 700 Center Avenue? It's the Marion, who's the opera singer? Marion somebody.
Yeah, Claire or,
Marion Claire, the Marion
Green
Claire.
Claire.
yeah,
I thought we landmarked
yeah,
the walls and the urns on top of the walls,
right,
the bushes and the grass work in front of that and stuff. We
yeah.
do a fairly comprehensive, it's not like pages long, but it's a fairly comprehensive list of the things that we liked in the garden. And I thought we had done a pretty good job of defining some of the landscape items there that we saw that we felt were important. So
Right. So we did for the Marion Claire estate. The other, the one you were talking about on Moffett is the Morseely estate.
yes,
And that's a national landmark, so that's protected from a higher degree. But I agree, there are some.
Wait a second. It is protected under the National Historic Register landmark, which means that is purely honorary. If you get a National Historic Register landmark, that means you can get it landmarked on Monday and bring in the bulldozers on Tuesday.
And we'll hold that thought, because we're going to get to the interplay. We're going to get to the interplay between National Register and our ordinance in a minute. That's one of our changes.
Right.
So just hang on to that.
Okay.
So the question I have for Glenn and the attorney, since it seems like the commissioners are talking about something that Just Me categorizes as a built landscape, that is a road, a wall, urns. We're not talking about and how the road curves through
Right,
Jensen's landscape. So
right.
I think we are in agreement. We would like to have a mechanism to landscape the built landscape, if that's the right terminology. And is there, and this is for you guys, can the definition of structure include, which includes gazebo and roadways and fire towers, so it includes a roadway. So if I would think, could we include this built landscape concept as a enhancement to the definition of a structure, so that it's not ephemeral, that it's very specific to these structures, to the bridge, to the roadway, to the entry gate? Is that possible? And
so that is. So first of all, thank you for having me back at one of your meetings. And so I would say that that's certainly a very doable thing, is to take a structure or a physical improvement that's easy to work in by playing with the definition of structure or other types of create a new term of improvement, or however we choose to define it. And I think that is a very different concept and much easier to deal with than how we, I think, have thought about landscaping in general, at least how it's written, where includes more what I would call the organic environment,
Right.
these bushes, grading of the ground.
Right.
Or so many things can change, and how do we measure a change? And if a tree dies, was it natural, was it not? But when you're talking about a roadway or any other type of constructed improvement, it's much easier to deal with.
Sure.
In terms of how that's changed. It allows Glenn and the rest of the village staff to be able to measure, is this a change? But, whether they have to come forward with a building permit anyway, and then has an opportunity to evaluate whether or not that, it be compliant with your code. So that, I think, is a very doable thing. The next question, though, is kind of, once you put those items to this, to your ordinance and define it, is what do you want to do with what I will call the organic features, whether it's a grading, whether it's bushes and shrubbery or trees or other things that aren't human built. And then it becomes a much more, I think, difficult task to lay out something with teeth in your code.
Okay.
That's a good explanation of the difference. Thank you.
Let me address your comment about human built, Ben. Ben, I don't know if you've had a chance to drive into Tangley Oaks in Lake Bluff, or had a chance to drive into Harrison House in Lake Bluff. But in either of those properties, if you drive into Tangley Oaks, the view that you get is what you're paying for. So what you paid the landscaper to create for you is a false lake. When you drive into Tangley Oaks, the little lake, the series of lakes that are there are all man-made lakes. And what Jens Jensen did was he drove you around in the woods, a left turn, a right turn, a left turn, and then he made you come around a sweeping bend, and you look down. You look downhill into a puddle, down into a pond of water, and then as you came around the bend, you looked up and saw the house 300 yards away. Okay? That's a specifically designed view. If you look at it on the architectural, on the landscaping drawings, it's absolutely designed, and in many cases, it's timed out as to how many seconds you will see it at 15 miles an hour. Okay, so that's a specifically designed view. So when you talk about changing that view, if someone decides, well, we don't like the headlights flashing through there anymore, so we want to plant a whole bunch of arborvitae in there, you're just like, well, no, you can't plant the arborvitae in there to shut out the headlights, because you're supposed to use your headlights to see the view at night. And so that's what a protected landscape is about. Okay,
So,
you're driving in so that you can enjoy the monumentality of the fact that I, Philip Armour, have arrived, and I have invited you, Ben Schuster, to my estate.
So, and I'm not trying to say that you shouldn't regulate that, and that's not worth regulating. I think the hard part, and where you have to really, if that's what you want to protect, it's a real task to try to define and create practical measures to be able to effectively enforce.
Right.
And to give you just an example, I'm looking at the language of the code. When we talk about alterations, and we define any act or process that significantly modifies or changes a protected landscape, including without limitation, regrading, removal of surfaces, removal of trees, or cultivated plants. So let's stop there for 1 second. So if you're talking about grading, is it all grading? What happens if it's slight? Is it grading over a certain amount? If you're talking about removal of plants, it's easy to say you can't remove a tree that's over a certain size. But when all of a sudden somebody wants to remove a small plant or a small row of plants, one, how does Glenn and the staff know about it? But more importantly, what is considered significant? What happens if it's just not cared for and not maintained, so it dies off through neglect versus being chopped down? And I guess this is the hard part, is how to create standards that give you the enforcement mechanisms that it becomes a meaningful way to have an ordinance that you can do something with. And at the same time, not scaring somebody from coming forward and discouraging them from landmarking because they're afraid every time they cut the grass, somebody's going to make hay, so to speak, and it becomes a big issue. Or they want to, you know, take out some roses and put in a tulip. It becomes a question of, can I do it? Do I have to come before this body? So that's the rub, and that's the hard part.
Well, and that's always the hard part of enforcing the ordinances. How far does the silly ordinance reach, right? Right?
Yeah.
Well, Paul, and
I
that's
think I
why
can go about 8 feet.
Paul, that's why I suggested this built landscape concept. So if it's something that, if we could come up with a way that we could, for those handful of very specific vistas that you mentioned, that we should be concerned, we should try to maintain as much of that as we can. Is there a way that we can define that in this built landscape concept, built vista concept, that would allow us to be able to protect, but also be able to enforce, define and enforce in a reasonable way?
I think that's fairly simple to do. I don't think that's onerous or impossible. You know, if the landscape.
Okay. Oh, so given that,
If the landscape.
Paul, can I ask you to work with Glenn and the attorney on drafting that language?
I'm happy to.
Okay, because I've tried, and we get stuck with concepts.
If the landscaper wants to come in and dump 4 inches of mulch, you know, in his annual mulching operations, that's fine. You know, but when you start bringing in the bulldozer and start changing the, you know, changing the size of the mound of the hill, you know, then, you know, that becomes fairly simple, fairly, you know, it requires a permit.
So can I also ask the other commissioners that, are we in agreement that this, if we use this built landscape concept so that a street's a vista created by a landscape architect, you know, the entry gates, those kinds of things that aren't buildings or structures are things that we do want to be able to protect? Are we in agreement with that?
Yeah.
I think it's important to protect the hardscape of areas. You know, and I think it is difficult to delineate what landscape or vegetation or organic matter you protect and don't protect, because things die and, I don't know, bushes get overgrown. But
Okay.
Paul's willing to work with that. But the hardscape, yes.
From legal perspective, we may be able to include it in an expanded definition of structure, or we may not, right?
I think we can. I would want to go back to the code and do an extensive review just to make sure that by explaining the word structure, the burden changes in any of the meanings of the other provisions. But whether it's structure or other type of improvement, we can certainly come up with a term or expand a definition, get exactly to what exactly you want.
Yeah.
Okay. And Paul, if you can be a sounding board as these guys draft this over the next couple of weeks.
It's not impossible. It sounds, you know, we're sort of making this larger than it is. It's not impossible.
Okay, good.
Sounds good to me.
So Glenn, let's move on to the next set of changes.
You want to back up real quick and we can talk?
You can go wherever you want us to. Go ahead.
Mr. Schuster, we were talking about this concept of an owner having to personally appear, and really how strict can we make that practically and still be on the right side of the law and a judge and so on. So we were talking about powers of attorney. I would say two questions if I can try to summarize the group's discussion. One, the big one, can you get any more strict or any more narrow with that? And then second, maybe just a bit of background. If you can just give people a brief explanation of what a power of attorney entails.
Yeah, so the issue, and when Glenn and I talked about this when we were looking at the language, is if you wanted to strictly say the owner must appear, you have several problems. The most obvious is when the owner is not a person. So when you have a corporate entity, you have a trust, you have any type of ownership that's on an individual person, then the question is, how do they appear? Well, you want somebody who has power of attorney, not just somebody to show up, but somebody who has power to bind and make decisions on behalf of the owner. So we tried to use the word power of attorney versus just representative or just attorney, but doing something to say that the person there has to be able to speak and bind that applicant. So for a corporation, it might be a corporate officer. It could be a trustee for a trust, but it actually gives you more power. And if you just said the owner must appear, you'd have a legal problem and a lot of questions when it's somebody else coming. The other issue is when you do have a person, but they may not have, they may not have the capacity to appear, whether it's because of disability or mental acuity or whatever the situation is. And so what we're doing is allowing somebody, again, who has the power to bind, to show up. And I think that's, from my conversations with Glenn, I think that's the goal, is to not for them to send somebody who can blow off the meeting with you, but rather to be able to make decisions. So that's why we drafted it the way we did.
Is that helpful for folks?
I think so, yes.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about the corporate or businesses owning, so yes. We talked about a situation where the landscaper showed up at the meetings when the owner could have potentially, and those are the kinds of things that are of concern.
And understand, this wouldn't necessarily prohibit it, but what it would require is that the owner to sign a document giving authority to that landscaper to bind the owner. Now, I can't imagine an owner would want to do it, but the great part is, because if you require power of attorney, that landscaper or architect or whoever it's going to be can't just show up and go, I don't know, I'm not the owner.
Yeah.
So
I think, go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay. Glenn, since we're at a pause point here, I'm sorry, I should have done this earlier. Could you introduce Samantha and give a little background?
Yeah, I was thinking to myself I should have done it at the start too. So Miss Samantha Lennox joins us from the University of Illinois Chicago. She has her planning undergraduate degree, and she's pursuing her master's in, well, Sam, I'll let you say the exact title of it. I forget, they all call themselves something a little different.
Yeah, at U of I, it's a little bit different than UIC, but at UIC, I'm pursuing the Master's of Urban Planning and Policy. And I'm hoping to focus a little bit more on environmental planning and policy. And I'm working on the Lake Bluff online, the GIS maps right now at the village.
Welcome.
Fantastic. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks. Great to have you.
I'm really excited to be here too. Hopefully
Good.
we'll be able to meet face to face, but in the meantime, this is
How
nice
long have
too.
you been on board? How long have you been here?
I think a month already.
Month? Wow.
Yeah.
What-
Did you say how long you will continue to be here? Is it?
Throughout the school year.
Wow.
Mhm.
And
Great.
where are you from?
I'm from Burr Ridge, a southwest suburb of Chicago.
Sure.
Oh, great.
Yes.
I know Burr Ridge. Okay.
So will you be with us 20 hours, 40, 10 a week?
It's anywhere between 16 to 24.
Okay,
So part-time.
wonderful.
Cool. All right.
Welcome.
Have you ever been to the King Brevard retirement home?
I have, yeah. My brother used to volunteer there.
Okay.
Mhm.
It's going to be published in my upcoming book on architecture, as my dad's architectural firm designed it.
Oh, no kidding. Wow.
Yeah.
Nice.
Come on over. I'll show you all the drawings of it.
Definitely.
Okay.
Well, welcome, Samantha. We look forward to working with you over the next year.
Thank you. Me too.
Okay, Glenn, I think we're on significant demolition review.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, we'll come back to the slide deck and try to breeze on through it.
Yeah, it was a good discussion. We got two of the sticking points that we needed to talk about.
So back on it, and we'll get through the rest. So change, again, thinking about really the distinguishing things out of these 33 pages that separated from what we have today. Significant demolition review right now today, it doesn't really have a stated purpose. If you read into it, it looks like the purpose is to provide a delay to allow someone to submit a landmark application, which there are only parties that can do that. So we broadened that out everywhere in this ordinance, especially here. You see that we have a statement of purpose that talks about what we're trying to do. So in this particular case, page 16.
Did you get my text? I had to put them in the bathroom. Oh.
We talk about how, yes, we want to see if we can landmark it, but we also want to encourage restoring it or reusing it, even if it shouldn't be a landmark. We want to talk about how it looks in the streetscape if it's not a landmark. And of course, we want to capture important information about it before it's in a landfill somewhere, you know. So we've tried to broaden our scope while still being really firmly within the purview of historic preservation, how this commission's worked. Simpler ideas.
If I could interject there, and we're on page 16, this is line 11 and 12 and 13. We had talked about the 50-year threshold, and that remains in place. So we still would be looking at any building that is 50 years old or older. That hasn't changed. I wanted to mention that because we talked about some modifications to that in the past, but that stays in.
So a couple of simple concepts. Demolition, instead of looking at floor area, which doesn't really work with exterior architectural appearance, right, and can be unpredictable at times. We look at square footage of exterior walls. So I have a vertical plane, you know, I have square feet here. This is a little goofy to, you know, calculate. It's not terribly common, but we thought it was reasonable, a reasonable compromise if you have an architect on the job to do the math, or most of the time you're just demolishing whole sections and you can just go based on the perimeter. Open to any other ideas about that. And finally, we turn the delay up slightly consistent with this group's discussions, recommendations in choosing Lake Bluff. Landmark designation, again, we're few minor changes here, nothing big going on. The first is work bottom up, significant. First, there are some ghost landmarks in the village. They have been destroyed, such as the Keck and Keck House up in the Crabtree Farm area that are destroyed, but they're still on the books. I mean, potentially you could make the argument that in some way they should be subject to review by this body if you were to build something else there. We don't think that's necessarily intended, and certainly that's outside of the historic district. That's not common in the ordinances we reviewed. So repealing that would be automatic, and that is common in some of the ones we looked at.
Much to everybody's surprise. Wow, okay.
On the other side of that, so we're at the end, now we're at the beginning. I think common sense, a rebuttable presumption that if you're on the National Register, you should be a Lake Bluff landmark. And finally, you know, throughout preparing this, we were trying to look at ways to show that we're trying to balance the great debate in this community when this subject has been raised in the past, you know, individual rights, community rights, preservation, so on. What I don't think anyone would disagree that trying to landmark a property at the time of its proposed demolition is probably where this ordinance has the most friction. Of course, that's perhaps what's most important. Certainly, the landmarking from under someone is a topic of great consternation when it comes up. And so what we propose here is really a compromise, just to say that we'll take 5 years as a commission and we'll be proactive about landmarking. And after that, if something comes forward, you know, we'll take it through significant demolition review, which is longer, but we won't try to landmark it.
I think that's a good plan. I think that we should be proactive about determining what we think should be landmarked and getting that process going, rather than waiting until somebody comes up and says, we want to tear this down, and we all go up in arms and jump up and down.
I'll mention one more here that's important to note. I think you've heard this thought from me before, but so right now, if delay is protection, right? That's the assumption of our ordinance. Theoretically, if you don't landmark a building, it's more protected than if it is landmarked. You have 120 days of demolition pause. You have the length of time it takes to landmark, and then you have the length of your advisory review. I think, yeah, so as part of this, you're still paused in the middle, but I did want to point out, it's not in the slide deck, for which I apologize. During these first 5 years, if you were to do that, if you were to have a significant demolition review, then landmark, then advisory review, the landmark is still a pause, but the time you took at demolition review, that counts. Again, bearing in mind these longer time frames, we didn't want to make them even longer in that circumstance. So just occurred to me, sorry.
So just two comments here on landmarks. The first, just to talk about, just to reiterate this sunset. So for 5 years from the date the ordinance is passed, we can, in the midst, if the village receives a demolition request on a non-landmark structure in the first 5 years, we can recommend landmarking for that structure. After 5 years, once there's a demolition request, then the village cannot begin landmark discussions. So as Glenn said, that gives us 5 years. And as Janie, I think, said, it gives us 5 years to get our act in order and to get our house up and running, but also to get landmarks landmarked, but also puts the onus on future commissions to actively pursue landmarking as the 50-year threshold hits us, as some of the West Terrace structures become potentially eligible. So that's one comment. The second is really a series of questions, Glenn, around the National Register rebuttable presumption. We may as well talk about these now. Do we need a landmark application for the village? Question number one. Question number two, does the village board need to approve these designations? And question number three, do we have to have a public hearing on each one of these?
Sure. So in order, I would say, one, yes, you need an application, and I think you want that. I mean, they're simple to prepare. They can be prepared administratively, but the biggest thing is you want to set the groundwork for, National Register establishes significance, but you still have your list of 20 criteria, and you want to draw some of those connections. To your second question, as drafted, it would require the village board's approval. To your third question, it would require a public hearing for each. I mean, I emphasize that those can be, I defer to the village attorney if you could do those as a group. Certainly there are ways that you could be expedient about proceeding through those.
Okay, that's helpful. I assume those were all the facts. And one of the things we'll talk about in the staff report is a separate list that I put together, and I've identified the 7 National Register areas that we have within the village. So we'll talk about that later, but we have a list we can begin with. Okay, thank you. Let's move to districts.
Any other questions on this part? I know we jumped around a little bit.
Well, I think this is great. I think it begins to remove the mousetrap that everybody gets caught in. So I think it's great.
Yes, I agree.
So do I. I have a really stupid question. If we can go back to page 18, I just want to be sure that I understand this. Under the procedure, the failure to act by commission paragraph.
What line is it, Sherry?
It's down on line 35.
Okay.
I wonder if you can give me an example, so I'm sure that I know what this means, that if the commission does not or cannot act, what would be the circumstance that we wouldn't act or could not act? Just because I know this is in other parts too.
Yeah, so it's commonly called a shot clock, and that's exactly what it is. So in this case, this is something you want, so you probably wouldn't do this, right? But certainly there are other circumstances in things the village does where rather than force a negative vote, a body may have an incentive to sit on something and essentially to deny it by inaction.
Okay.
And so it's a fail-safe. It's a common provision.
I just want
Passive resistance.
Yeah, thank you.
And oftentimes I've seen this happen where you have a situation where, particularly if you have an even number of people on a commission and you are split 50-50 and you cannot get a majority to recommend against or recommend for, and it just sits there. So what does that mean? Well, if you don't do anything, it just dies on the vine. But without having some sort of presumption, it leads to a question of what happens.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, let's go into districts and neighborhoods.
And as a note to self, and I'll say it out loud for your benefit, on line 37, we'll make that say 90 days after your first meeting, not 90 days after you receive it, I think. Or we need to retool that somehow, since it's 90 days to start it and 90 days to finish it. We need a gap there. So that's a good catch.
Okay.
Then since I'm asking those kinds of questions on the next page, line 6, failure to act by the village board, it says either approve or deny the designation of a historic neighborhood. Is that supposed to be just the historic neighborhood, or?
That is left over from a prior draft. Those whole couple lines are. So we will take care of that as well.
Thank you.
Good eyes. All right. So historic districts, if you were part of this group's discussion in 2007, 2008, this is somewhat familiar to you. If you're not, essentially a historic district, in short, from just a regulatory perspective, being very simple, it's landmarking in mass. So you have a given area. For in a traditional district, you have perhaps many features that are contributing to the district. They are historically notable. You may have some that happen to be included that aren't. You know, a house was torn down, a new house was built. It's included in the district anyway. But you're recognizing the district for having some, of course, significance and cohesion and things hanging together. And so typically that goes through a process where it goes to a commission, then it goes to the village board, and then commonly what we see is along the way, this is based on the National Register criteria, but the neighborhood will be asked to approve or to assent or not to veto it being established as a historic district. What we've done is bring you back a similar proposal to that 2007-2008 proposal. The process is very similar to landmarking. You look at almost all the same things. On page 21, I do want to point out there are a couple criteria specific to districts. If the concepts make sense, we can work with the numbers, but so you want districts that are at least a majority contributing. You want districts that are reasonably compact. There's a second type of district, a thematic district, that let's say you have the Seven Sisters or the Camp Meeting Houses. It would let you pick out individual ones throughout the town and do it together. But essentially, it's very similar to the landmarking process. What's different from 2006 to 2008, and again, another unique proposal we've thrown out there for you, that this canvas of owners really can come at the end. So in past drafts in many communities, the commission recommends, then a canvas occurs, then the village board approves at the end. In this case, the commission recommends, the village board approves, and then it's firmly in the hands of owners. And if they choose to decline that, if over 50% exercise a veto, essentially, it's only a historic designation. This is your historic neighborhood designation from choosing Lake Bluff, if you remember that conversation. If fewer than fail to do so, it becomes a district, and then properties within the district are subject to advisory review.
Is there anything in place for if we recommend that a district be approved, knowing that there's a neighborhood or something that wants it, and it goes to the village board and they deny it, our recommendation, but the group of buildings or homes or something still would vote over 50%? Is there any thought about that? I just wonder about us going through the efforts and making a recommendation about doing that. We've had some challenges with village boards.
Members.
Yeah, just their feeling that this would be a good thing. So I think this is great, and I agree with what you said, but I just wonder how that relationship affects, I guess is my question.
Interesting.
So I was wondering, Glenn, Glenn, what prompted the change in the process? The flipping around of the process? Not having the camera.
Yeah, it just kind of came out of drafting, really. We had these two different ideas, one of having a historic district and one of having a historic neighborhood, and one was honorary and one wasn't. It was the same
Okay.
criteria. Kind of said, well, how do you pick? And I mean, it would be what the owners want, and perhaps that would probably be your line. I mean, it's hard to say less significant, more significant. It's a really blurry line. And you know, I think it was actually, this might have been a Steve Krause special, but it just came out of the writer's room.
Okay, just curious.
Okay.
The writer's room.
So the concept here is our body would determine a district. We would define it, we would identify it, we would go through the process, and we would actually recommend to the village board that this either contiguous or thematic district should be identified as a historic district in Lake Bluff. The village board would then have the opportunity to approve or disapprove that recommendation, right? And then, and I'm sorry, it must be getting late. So the village board approves, yeah, and then there's the canvas. So
Okay.
for the question we had before, if the village board approves, then it goes to the, if the village board approves, then it is
Goes
automatically a
to
neighborhood.
canvas.
It's automatically a neighborhood, and then we're asking the residents if you would like to be a historic district. The difference being that if you're in a historic district, then there are significant review processes that would have to follow if you want to do a modification. But no, if the village board says no, then I believe under this ordinance, the process stops and there would be no designation as a neighborhood or as a district.
Mm.
So there wouldn't be a vote for the property owners if the village board doesn't agree.
I see.
And that takes us into the Lake Bluff tried and true process of everybody lobbying and trying to leverage your village trustees. And
Yeah.
I don't know, you know, how much fun that can be in this town, because everybody has an opinion. Everybody wants to make sure that the trustees all know, you know, my opinion as opposed to your opinion. And so that's a process for the, if there's a very strong anti-group in addition to a very strong pro-group, then those two groups end up having the opportunity to really lobby and really try and leverage the village trustees at that trustee vote before you finally come down to a true neighborhood vote. And so therein, whether you think that's a good process or a good or bad process, that's what's going to occur.
So when we finish this,
Go ahead, Sherry.
sorry, Janie, when we finish the revisions that we're making to this right now, does this whole ordinance then go to the village board for approval?
Oh yeah, they have to approve.
So they're going to see this and say what they think about it before we even get to that step, likely.
Right.
Well, there will be a discussion around districts, yeah.
Right.
So, yeah, there will be a discussion around districts.
Do we have any preliminary sense of how that might go?
After 15 years of doing this, I don't know. The idea here is that, you know, so as the, you know, the body responsible for historic preservation, we come up with the idea of the district. And we present it, if this passes the way it's designed to, we present it to the village board and recommend that it be a district because of these particular criteria. We have to pitch it to them. They'll listen to neighbors, and then they'll vote. They have to vote, but it's not final. So because we're looking at a series of steps for advisory review, if this is a historic district, that's where the property owners then have their vote, have their hand. So it is meeting the village board. One of the reasons this, the concepts of districts have been controversial is just this, you know, process of advisory review and having a vote that would then have to be approved by the village board, essentially. So this takes it in a different way. If the village board approves it, it still isn't final until the property owners approve it. But
Yeah.
at least we get the designation of historic neighborhood on the books.
Good.
And, go ahead.
I just said good.
Oh, I was gonna say, it does take some of the onerous responsibility off of some of the governing bodies, because the people always still get to decide whether they
Correct.
want it to be a district.
Correct.
Okay, Paul, I would like to ask you, when I ran into you Saturday, you said something about some process you were pursuing. Was that on a national level?
It's a National Historic Register district. That's
Okay.
something completely outside of what we're doing here tonight.
And like you said, that's just an honorary.
It's completely honorary.
Right. Right.
Okay, I have a couple of questions around the definitions of contiguous and thematic districts. So on page 21 of the ordinance, I just want to make sure we're clear and before we go on. So contiguous is what it means is that you draw a boundary around the district that you want to create. I think that 50% under A2, 50% of the properties are included as contributing. I think that's fine. I would be surprised if that would be that low. So I think we would draw the boundaries to include the contributing and exclude the non-contributing. I question the number 10, and Glenn knew this was going to come up. I can think of contiguous districts that potentially have fewer than 10 structures in total. So if you, looking out my window here, if we look at the artist colony, very strictly defined, there are not 10 structures that historically have been identified as part of the artist colony.
Yeah, I don't know why it has to be a size of 10. I think we can just simply define it as properties and leave the size of it undefined. So I don't think anybody's going to go through the time and effort to come up with a 2 or 3 household district or a household, neighborhood. But someone mentioned the 7 sisters before. They're the 7 colonial style houses at the corner of McKinley and Sheridan Road. There were 7, there are now 6.
I was gonna say it's 6 sisters now.
Yeah.
It's all designed by the same architect, built by the same builder, and it was built. What my dad explained to me was that the architect did it specifically as a small intellectual study of the 7 different styles of colonial architecture that were popular in 1948, 49, when all of that was built. So one's a New York, one's an Upper New York colonial, another one's a Maryland colonial, another one's considered a North Carolina colonial. So they're all definable according to the colonial nomenclature, I guess. I haven't studied that, so with any detail, but that's what I was told.
So Glenn, is there any reason it's 10? Is it just to preclude really small districts?
Yeah, I think 10's a Highland Park number. I mean, it's not uncommon to have some number. Again, just, how small of a district is too small. The level of effort this takes does sort of self-regulate the problem. You could delete that whole numeral 3 if you wanted to, I think. Just understand that.
I would be in favor of doing that because we do have some little pockets that are interesting. I'm thinking of when we do the tours, there are certain homes like the Hyde Park homes and stuff like that. There are certainly less than 10.
So I don't think there's any harm if we just take clause 3 out.
We'll do it.
Okay. And then under thematic, I like this because it would allow us, for example, if we have a thematic, if we have a discussion around camp meeting cottages that still exist in their relatively original state, we certainly can identify them because we can see them. If you think of Prospect, there's a bunch that are there. They are not necessarily contiguous. There's some on Prospect, there's some on North, there's some on Center. There's probably others. And we often don't know much about each individual structure other than was built in this camp meeting era. So that would give us an opportunity to put landmark designation around structures that we really don't have a lot of history, but still protected as part of a district. So that's just kind of my 2 cents on that.
I have a question. Would a home's designation as being in one district be exclusive of all other districts, or could a home hypothetically be in more than one district because it has more than one type of historic significance?
Absolutely. I would think you could have a house, especially along Prospect Avenue, in multiple districts.
Okay.
Multiple thematic and multiple historic.
Contiguous, yeah. Okay.
Because you may have had, over time, you may have had significant owners of different eras. And so you may have different levels of social history. So you may have an architectural history beginning in the camp meeting era, and then you may have had somebody there in the 1920s who, was a published author or something like that, and
Sure.
that becomes then a different history.
Okay.
Yep. Okay, any other comments on districts?
I have one, just back for a second to the concept of 10. And just to give you a hypothetical, and I'm not saying 10 is the right number. One thing to think about though is if you have, let's say, 3 homes, 3 features that will, and 2 people want to be in a district and they want to try to pull in the 3rd. So you more than 51%, so they could do it if you would allow it, if the village would allow it. And then somebody who doesn't want to be in can't stop it. Now, by having more, theoretically, you could make the argument about process that it's kind of prevents that. Now that said, there's still a check because the village would still be approving what it considers to be the district. But that is just one concept on the numbers. By having a larger number, it's more of a process of getting people to agree to it. So I'll just leave it at that, but just something to consider.
Okay, those are good thoughts. I don't know what the right number would be.
Ben, I think you've defined that 3 is the smallest number we could have, because if you have a historic district,
Two.
2 members in it, the
Yeah.
vote gets pretty complex. One up, one down. Now what do you do?
Yeah. At least from my perspective, I think just not referencing the individual number and leaving the decisions to the HPC initially, I think is appropriate.
Yeah,
I agree.
just let it fly.
Okay. All right, on to advisory review.
Sure, virtually no changes here. Again, a lot of things are smoothed out. We talked about if you were to have that 2-step advisory review after significant demolition review, that matters there. And the only big change here is, again, turning the dial up. So for demolitions, you go from 150-day maximum to 365-day maximum. Again, bearing in mind that an owner's failure to appear would further potentially draw that out, which we should still come back to. And then for certification, even though it is yet to be used, we didn't feel it was necessary to delete it. And so we left that in place. And again, I've smoothed out the process a bit, but if someone were to want to certify their property, that pathway is there for them.
So let me refer now to Glenn's memo, July 2nd, the box on the first page, because to me, this is a really critical piece of this. So we're thinking about 2 things. We're thinking about significant demolitions of a non-landmark structure, and we're thinking about advisory reviews requesting alterations / demolition of a landmark. So the first one is non-landmark, and in effect, what we're doing is recommending the village board extend the maximum period from 120 days to 180 days, with some of that being HPC and some of that being village board. So if we get a non-landmark structure and get a demo request, we're essentially asking the village board, suggesting that the village board increase this by 60 days to 180. If we have a landmark and thinking 5 years ahead, and we will have multiple numbers of landmarks than we have now. So if we have a landmark, we're suggesting that we go from 150 total days to 365. So and that's why this whole discussion of districts and owner approval is important, because that 365 advisory review maximum would apply to significant alterations within a structure that is contained within an approved district.
Okay.
Well, and I would finesse that a bit. So, and let me walk you through the read. I want to make sure I've got my interpretation right. Sorry, give me just 1 sec. We've been through enough of these that I have to think about where to find something now.
So while you're looking, let me ask Ben a question. Assuming that this ordinance is approved by the village board as written, what happens to current landmarks? Because we would be extending, certainly under an advisory review, we would be extending the review period significantly. Would they be able to opt out? Would they automatically have to comply? Would there be a vote? How would that practically work?
If they are a landmark now, the process may change, but they would be subject to it.
Okay.
I don't see a change, and if you want, now if you wanted to somehow exempt them and say if you were a landmark prior to such a date, you are not subject to these provisions, you could do that, and that's your choice.
Okay, I wouldn't do that, but it's good to know that we can if that becomes something the village board would be interested in. Glenn, did
So, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
For advisory review of a landmarked home, if we send it on to the village board with the recommendation that it, be extended, can the village board then opt to do it for 30, 60, 120 days? And how would they can they do their own extensions, like do it for 60 days and then do it for 60 more? What falls within that 245 days extension?
My understanding is that just like it currently is, the village board can do within the maximum time frame allowed by ordinance, can do what they perceive as best. So they could make it. They could make it shorter, but not longer.
Sure. Okay. Okay, thank you.
So, yeah, Louis, to your point too, there's another concept of your thought, which was you could do one or more extensions. It's a cumulative total of that 245 days.
Okay, thank you.
To the earlier question, and maybe we can make this a bit more clear, right? So, in a historic district, the way this is set up, again, fairly common, there are contributing features, which you say are important to the district, and there are non-contributing features. When you're talking about a demolition that triggers these longer review periods, you have two parts, right? One is a demolition, but also is it to a protected feature. Maybe a simpler way to say it is this: if you were demolishing one of those features that you listed in the district, that's going to take that full, potentially up to 365 days. If you're listing one of those features that you're not, that would be treated as an alteration. So you have a landmark house, you change the windows, that's an alteration. You have a historic district, you have a house built in 2017, you decide that, Art Deco is so passé, you want to tear it down and start over. That's an alteration, the way this is written right now. And so that's actually subject to a very short time period, 60 days. Perhaps you would tweak this a bit to align it to your significant demolition review in that case. But the important thing, when we can make that change, I would probably recommend it from what I understand from this group. But the important thing to emphasize is that, just because it's inside the boundaries of this district, if it's not contributing, you get more influence over the appearance, but not over the act of demolition with our intent here. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I think that's fine.
Yep. Okay, I think we've reached the end of the deck and we get the discussion points, and we've talked about all three of these. So if So here's my, unless are there any other questions or comments on the draft from the commissioners?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not a commissioner, but if you would allow me.
Yes, sir. Go right ahead.
I would come back a bit to number 2, just to get a bit more of the group sense. We talked a lot about how this works, but not necessarily how to approach this, because I would caution you against proceeding with this written the way it is. The idea that a homeowner could have to personally appear once every 30 days for a year may not be received positively. There are a few ways you could do this. You could just set a number. You could say after they show up 3 times, that's the ball game. An interesting one perhaps would be periodically. So, they show up at 3 months, they show up at 6 months, they show up at 9 months. There's a few ways you could skin the cat, as the euphemism goes, but certainly I would recommend that you do something different, and I think we would appreciate your direction on what that looks like.
What's your concern?
Just as written today, you have a very long demolition delay of 365 days, and as is written here, the owner would have to personally appear or have their somewhat power attorney appear at each of those meetings along the way. Now, if you think that's appropriate and necessary, we can bring it as it is, but that was left in as a artifact of drafting. We're not sure if that's an intended consequence.
So when the HPC, our current protocols typically, so some come to one meeting and it's okay, you can do what you want. That's a straightforward decision on our part. Many of them are, we want this to be, we pretty much know, if not at the first meeting, then certainly the second, that we're going to take our maximum and we're going to recommend that the village board take their action that they consider extending. Would that, if we then make that recommendation to the village board, that doesn't appear on our agenda, does it? So if we have a 90-day, if we have a 120-day delay and we're in the 65th day and we have a meeting, would that be on our agenda even though we have already voted to have the maximum delay that we can impose?
I would defer to the village attorney if that would be prudent, but you wouldn't be required to be. I mean, this tolling provision, it's your initiative to impose it. So you have the meeting, someone doesn't show up, you say,
so the homeowner does what they're supposed to do. They come in front of us, they make their presentation.
If you want to take your delay and stop talking about it, again, yes. I would defer to Ben, but the way this is written, I would think that's acceptable.
I think that's right.
Okay, so that's sort of, I think we make our decision once, and if our decision is that we extend to the maximum and recommend the village board consider an additional maximum, then it doesn't appear on our agenda again, right? And if it doesn't, then there's no requirement for the property owner to attend. I think that becomes a moot question, unless I'm missing something.
Well, if you had a particularly onerous situation, would you have different interests in continuing to talk about it? I mean, for example, I believe 512 Sunrise was on every Historic Preservation Commission agenda until it was destroyed.
And in that situation, I think the requirement for a property owner or the designee is appropriate. If there still is discussion around the recommendation of the Historic Preservation Commission, I think that's appropriate for the owner to be there.
Agree. Yeah.
Okay.
But if we make our recommendation to the village board to extend the maximum from the HPC, and there is no reason for that to be on the agenda, no new facts or no new testimony, then I think it's not on the agenda, so the owner doesn't need to be there. We okay with that?
Yes,
I am.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So if we can't, so there are not a whole lot of changes here. So we still have to do really only the landscape discussion and some cleaning up of other things. I would really like to be able to, do we need a public hearing, Glenn, to approve this? I assume we do.
Yeah, let's talk about a little bit of process. So at its simplest, let me rephrase, at its fastest, this probably needs to go to the village board for discussion at a committee of the whole before you send them an ordinance. So let's say you were to start today and say, let's get rolling. I would say you would go to the board on the 27th of July. You wanted to go this fast, I mean, you could be ready to talk more formally about the ordinance and a formal recommendation on August 10th. The board could continue to consider it through first and second reading on the 24th and the 14th. The act of recommending doesn't, take a public hearing. I would say, and I defer to the village attorney on this, depending on, for example, what comes out of our landscape discussion. I mean, potentially some of what you're enacting is considered repealing a landmark. So you may have to do a public hearing on that along the way and, do the notice to those landmarks that are affected. Again, I don't think that would really slow down your process. That's just procedural step.
So,
But I think, and I'm just looking at your code, I'll confirm with Glenn. I don't know though that it requires, it's not a text amendment to your zoning code. So it's in the building code chapter of the village code. So it doesn't follow the same strict rules for approval as a zoning amendment would. So you don't have the normal public hearing process in the same manner.
yeah, although that said, I think we would want the opportunity to, just talking off the top of my head, I think we would want the opportunity to have this on an HPC agenda for public
You can
comment.
totally do it as a public meeting, invite everybody to come and provide comments. And that would be something that's obviously what might be very beneficial. It just wouldn't be technically, I don't think, a public hearing.
Okay.
But that's a legal difference, not a substantive difference.
Okay, well, from my perspective, we want to get this done as quickly as we can. But it doesn't need to be, it's not particularly urgent, but we want to get it done without delay. It really is going to depend on you guys for getting these comments from tonight into a revised draft that we can look at, number one, and then number two, getting a committee of the whole meeting with the village board. And maybe maybe we should shoot for that to get that done in the village board timeline. Okay. Even if we don't have completely final language, I think we know the direction we want to go in the landscape. But I would like to get the village board comments, if we could, before the next HPC meeting, so that we could either at the next HPC meeting or the one after that actually vote to recommend the new ordinance. Glenn, does that make sense?
Yeah, the only hiccup along the way is, from time to time the board cancels its second July meeting. So of course, if they cancel that, we may not be able to schedule a cow then. We can, actually, in this case, the cow would be immediately before, the August committee of the whole would be right before your meeting. So one way or another, we can make the timing work. We can look at a quick special or something if we need to go over anything.
Okay. And maybe it would be just better to give us that extra couple of weeks and have the committee of the whole meeting be the week before or the couple of days before our regularly scheduled August meeting.
I think that's great.
Why don't we do that? Let's plan on, if the village board agrees, we'll have a committee of the whole meeting in early August. Our meeting, hopefully to approve an ordinance, would come right after that. I would also be taking any input from village residents and
Gives us a little time to stew on it, yes.
yeah. Okay. Anything else on the ordinance? Okay. Just
Right.
a couple.
I think the changes we have put together to this, we've been struggling with this for ages and ages. I think the changes we put together this are great. And I think we can manage to get all of this put in place. And I don't think it's overly onerous on anybody in the entire village. So I think this is going to be a good process to finally get completed.
Yeah, I agree. And I'd like to get this completed because let's go to,
Because Christmas is coming, right?
well, if we go to commissioner and subcommittee reports, if you can pull out the one pager that was in our, one of the emails, I think, possible historic landmarks discussion draft. So under the assumption that we're going to have an ordinance that will allow us to move ahead on our landmarking. There you go. It's in front of us right now. I've just pulled together, based on the research I've been doing recently, two sets of lists. One is the structures that are already on the National Register and are not currently local landmarks. So there's 7 there. The Uptown District, number 7, has lots of different structures attached. And then the second set of lists are individual structures or groups that I have identified really just off the top of my head. The first one, so the reason, why did I do this? The reason I did this is that we may have more staff support to help in putting the application forms together. And I'll let Glenn talk about that. But to the degree that we have resources available, I want to give those resources a prioritized list of structures to complete the landmark application so we can begin discussing them as soon as the village board approves the new ordinance. The first group under A seemed to be absolutely something we should do, especially if there's a presumption of approval. And then the other ones, if we can get a few people, Paul has already said he would be happy to think about some individual structures to add. The idea is to have this list of 10, 15, 20, put them in sequence, and just every time we have a meeting, we do 1 or 2 of these things, and we just keep them rolling, at least 1 a month until we get through the list.
Thank you. That's a good idea.
Now, one of the things that Steve and I talked about is how much documentation is involved with this. So on a lot of these, we're going to end up with, I think, 1.5 pages or 2 pages, probably not ever more than 4 pages of typed text regarding one of these properties. And so if we talk about some of the houses or some of the properties in the commercial district, we can speak their histories of them, but since that's been documented, there isn't a great deal more that's there. So some of these reports are going to be fairly simple and fairly succinct. Some of the other ones, as Steve pointed out, have a lot of social history to them. And so then we end up adding more and more to that. But I think there's a certain limit to the amount of social history that you can add to these, other than just tossing in all of the great gossip that we might have, available to us. But as far as, social history, we talk in terms of 666 Maple, the clothes house. There's a great deal of history there. So that might be, several pages of information about Ben Close and his parents and the original settlers. Well, when you talk about the 500 North Avenue, the camp meeting headquarters, it was the headquarters. It was on Prospect Avenue for a number of years. After it had stood there for 20 or 25 years, it was moved over to North Avenue. The guy who ran it ran a taxi service and a livery service out of the barn in the back. And then it sort of just became a residence. So, there's a certain amount of history that we have there that we can document, but then the history, it doesn't seem to carry forward a great deal. So I think some of these reports are fairly simple and straightforward to work on and to write.
And there's a lot of information on all of these at the History Museum in the archives too.
Yeah.
Is that something Samantha will be able to help with?
Well, I'm hoping so.
Yeah, so we can maybe smoother if we come back to that at staff report, but yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so that's great. We just need to think about what I would like every commissioner to do is look at the list that I've thrown together and noodle over them, and just why don't we submit to Glenn any additions to the list, and then I'll put these all together and we'll try to figure out a priority list for getting the Part B done. We're going to start with A and then we'll go through the Part B. So within the next couple of weeks, if you could do some research on, think about structures that you think would apply for landmarking. I can come up with another 10 at least. Let's get a list together, coordinate through Glenn, and we'll discuss it at our next meeting.
Do we have this list or
This was in an email, I think,
okay.
that Glenn sent.
How long ago, Glenn? Do you remember?
It was
Monday.
the email that contained the PowerPoint presentation.
Oh, okay. All right. So I can
Or
find
Tuesday.
that. Not a
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah, it's not too deep. So, Glenn, can you confirm, is the Ralph Pool House at 1010 Green Bay Road, has that been listed on the National Historic Register?
Yes.
Wow, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, that I actually have I just wrote the history walk or the app material, and I actually have the application.
Okay. I wonder if that's a Susan Benjamin special. Huh.
It is.
Okay.
Okay, any other subcommittee reports or commissioner reports?
Well, I think this is great stuff.
Yeah, it's exciting.
So staff report?
Sure. So just a few items. One, I already introduced Miss Lennox. We're glad to have her here. I'd mention also we're, I think, pretty close to having an undergraduate for at least the fall semester from Wake Forest College. Again, another student interested in urban planning. I would say that while the pandemic has had very unfortunate consequences, the upside is that there are people that we can help out that have been displaced from their prior plans, and that we're happy to put to good use. So win-win situation. So with that said, of course, we assign interns to jobs throughout the village as needed. Certainly a lot of capacity, I think, for the Preservation Commission, and to try and cross some of these things off the list. I guess the only other thing I would say, a small announcement on a personal level here. So historic preservation is, of course, a discipline of planning. That's part of why Sam is joining us, as well as perhaps our undergraduate as well. Here a couple weeks ago, I passed the comprehensive planning examination from the American Planning Association. So whenever they send me the bill, I can call myself a member of the Institute of Certified Planners. So
Congratulations.
Wow.
That's exciting.
Good
Good work,
job.
Glenn.
Good job, Glenn.
thank you. No,
And that's not an easy thing to get. So congratulations.
Yeah. Very impressive. Thank you for doing that. Yeah, that's exciting.
yeah, especially, you know, I have a same management degree, I don't have a planning degree, and so it was really important for me to do that, and I'm glad to have it.
We're glad you have it too. Now don't leave us because you can go on to greener pastures.
I was
Yeah.
going to say that. You have to stay for now.
So, and just finally, just to reiterate, Glenn, what you said, the HPC will take as many hours as the village can spare our new staff to help us with putting applications together and getting the process going.
Certainly, and as Ms. Lennox already gave away, we are, we are coming back. Already one of her first projects is working with the Benjamin survey data and finalizing some of the work we've been putting into that first draft of Lake Bluff Online. So hopefully a lot of things coming together at the right time.
Yeah.
So just to take it out of code, taking the new Benjamin report, the last time we met, she went through all that good data. For
One meeting ago,
yeah, one meeting ago.
Yeah.
For the terraces, and getting all of that information loaded onto the online database. So that would be very helpful.
Yeah, and a lot of just cleanup along the way. You know, that original rollout was a proof of concept, and so there's some polish that will help make that a usable product for the public.
Great.
When can we get another look at that?
It's live now. I use it all the time.
All right.
When I use it for lots of different interesting reasons, just as I'm doing writing the walks.
Very good. Okay.
Anything else? Anyone? Hearing nothing, I would, do we need to do a roll call vote to adjourn?
You do.
Let's do a roll call vote to adjourn.
You do.
Motion to adjourn, please.
So
So
moved.
moved.
Second,
Second.
roll call vote, please.
Member Bergman,
Yes.
Member George,
Yes.
Member Liebolt is not here. He had joined us for a while. Member Nickel,
Yes.
Member Richardson,
Yes.
Chair Kraus.
Yes, we are adjourned.
Are adjourned.
Thank you
And I'm
all.
at the
Thank
end of
you,
my
Steve
battery.
and Glenn, for all your good work.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Yes, it's amazing.
Good to see
Thank
you.
you.
Good to see you
Thanks,
all.
Ben, as well.
Bye-bye.
He put in plenty.
Yeah,
Take
thank you,
care,
Ben.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Well.